Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is no longer the Cube LA podcast. I will repeat, this is no longer the Cube LA podcast. I've changed the name. It is now psychadjacent, and I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Hughes. I am happy to be back, but obviously things look a little bit different, so we're just going to carry on. Just a few announcements. Dr. Asante Dixon will be joining me in the next couple of weeks. He's a neuroradiologist, and we will be discussing the positives and the negatives of our current medical education system. And Dr. Alan Govea, he is a cardiologist in California, and he's also an old med school classmate of mine. And we'll be talking about heart health and just catching up with each other since I last saw him. So be on the lookout for those episodes. But for now, I have Miss Edith Shreckengast with me. Hello, Edith.
Hello.
Are you ready to start?
I am.
All right, great. All right, we're back. I'm here with Edith Shreckengast. From this point on, I'll call you Edie.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. You are a registered dietitian and board certified in sports nutrition in Washington State. You received your master's in nutrition from Virginia Tech. By the way, I'm from Virginia, so that's
Yes.
very happy to have someone that received their education from Virginia like me. So
Go Hokies.
You've consulted with various teams and universities, including but not limited to the Pittsburgh Steelers, the University of Pittsburgh, and you're currently consulting with Seattle University and the Seattle Mariners, a professional baseball team.
Yep.
Well, there's more that I could probably say, but bottom line is if I need to speak to someone about athletes and their diets, you are the person that I would go to. Do you agree with that? You know what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. So I eat, live, and breathe everything sports nutrition. I just love supporting athletes.
Awesome. So, I always like to give a very baseline understanding of who I'm speaking to. So if you could tell the audience, how did you become interested in a career as a dietitian?
Yeah. So I think it's integral as part of my passion in sports too. So I was always always played sports. And so that really led me to interest in sports nutrition. So I started out at a D3 school where I ran cross country and track, loved it. I was a biology major, but I knew I wanted to go into nutrition. So to do that, you need a specific degree in dietetics, a qualifying program, and then you would sit for an exam. After you do an internship, if you get in, and then you become a registered dietitian. So that's where I transferred to Virginia Tech, and my passion for sports nutrition, really, I was able to fulfill that or start that learning experience too. So I got a degree in dietetics, undergraduate, and then I stayed on for my master's. And during that time, I was able to work with a sports dietitian, and they have a phenomenal team now at Virginia Tech, and they did then too. But I was able to do undergraduate and then graduate support for their athletes and fueling stations, and just being involved with the football team and all of the other varsity sports. So much fun. And so that's when I really knew, with that hands-on experience, that's what I want to do and help support other athletes. Since I was an athlete myself, I joke I'm retired now, but yeah.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all?
Yeah, I know. I'm like, man. But yeah, so I was able to fulfill a lot of athletic aspirations I had I transitioned to triathlons. I had a superb triathlon coach, Jim McGehee, one-on-one endurance. He was amazing, and he is amazing. And so I was able to not just combine my passion for sports nutrition, but actually implement it in my career and see that improve in my performance from running, transitioning to triathlon. So that's basically how my interest really started. Becoming a dietitian, it's so integrated into my own identity as an athlete at the time.
Right, because if you're gonna be involved in athletics, you have to fuel your body properly, right?
Totally. And I saw, it was funny, I saw a difference too when I started fueling appropriately. So fueling to meet my sports demands instead of unintentionally under fueling or not fueling correctly, in that didn't have enough energy intake for the training load at the time at Christopher Newport University, where I first went to school. And I just saw injury after injury. And then when I transitioned to Virginia Tech and I learned, how to actually implement the importance of, appropriate fueling for your energy demands, and like, oh my gosh, having energy to compete, and not limiting certain food groups, it really helped me perform better. And I remember I PR'd in the 10K in a half marathon race when I was training for triathlons. So just to have that type of experience and then to go and do it really helped me, like, have a passion for it. This is why I want to help others with too.
Right, right. Yeah. Now that I'm a bit, I say that I'm retired too. I stopped playing sports like after high school.
Uh-huh.
I looked at what it took. So, first of all, I was a decent athlete. I wasn't like top notch when I was in high school. And I did track and I did football up until sophomore year. And I had some health issues where I stopped playing football, but I was able to still compete in track.
Yeah.
I maybe could have gone D2 and maybe could have walked on to like a D1 school or something, but I looked at what it took to actually be good at sports at that level. And no, thank you.
Yeah. That was like me. It was like at running, I was like, I was okay. Like I was definitely, I could compete D3, maybe D2, D1 was probably out of reach. But then when I transitioned to triathlons and really like targeted my nutrition to help support not just me as an athlete, but as a human being too, it really helped elevate. And I was able to become collegiate All-American in that triathlon. But that's a club sport, which, not to diminish it, but it's really coming all together. So it's, oh my gosh, it's so much fun to see a positive change like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like now that I'm, on the other side of, that decision, I now look at what they have to do. When you're an athlete, I see the body as like a tool that needs proper maintenance in order to work properly. Diet is just one part of those maintenance, one of those maintenance things that you have to do to take care of it. But again, the working out and stuff, I wasn't. No.
Yeah, it can be pretty intense.
Okay, so that's how you started your career as a dietitian, but you're now working with professional teams now. Mm-hmm. Which I'm going to assume is competitive and difficult to get connected with. So how did you become connected to the Seattle Mariners? I think I saw the Pittsburgh Steelers there too. Like how did that happen?
Yeah, so when I actually went over to Pittsburgh for my dietech internship, I connected with a mentor, Leslie Bonsi. She's a juggernaut in the sports nutrition world, and she was the Pittsburgh Steelers dietitian for I think over 14, 15 years. And so I started working with her with the University of Pittsburgh football team, and then they share the same training facility with the Steelers. So that's how I was able to get integrated with the Steelers. Yeah.
Okay.
And work lunches and just being involved in that type of atmosphere. And it's hard. It's really hard to get your foot in the door. So that was a really important, first I started volunteering and then working towards that goal. And I knew I wanted to be involved with sports, and at the professional setting, it's just an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. Did you grow up in a sports oriented family?
I actually did not. So
really? Wow.
Yeah. So I know. But my family was very supportive. I have a competitive drive. So I wanted to play professional soccer at a very young age, but then I tore my ACL and meniscus. I definitely could have gone collegiate at a certain level. But then once I had those injuries early on in high school, I transitioned to running. Right. And so no, my family's, especially my mom and my dad, they would let me pick whichever sport I wanted to do and at whatever level I could achieve. So there wasn't pressure to perform well. It was just like, well, if you like that and that sounds fun, go for it.
Yeah, well, that makes it more fun, right? There's pressure I do think there are athletes that have a lot of pressure where they need to make it to the college level. They need to make it to the pros because there's not really many other opportunities to make a living other than as an athlete.
Right. And that can be very ingrained, especially when I think our society too is going more to transitioning more to like early development of one sport versus having a child play multiple sports and seeing what they like best or what they jive with. And so, for example, like you can now see developmental camps for very younger age groups than you did 10 years ago.
Right. So so considering the fact you've worked with professional athletes and at the college level also, where would you say on average the understanding is of what needs to go into one's body to be healthy from an athlete, a professional one, or even a college one?
Yeah, so it's really dependent on the buy-in of the athlete, and especially at the professional level. Is it a minor leaguer that's stepping on that sub-elite that's really wanting to try to make that big contract? Or is it, the major leaguer where they've been doing what they've been doing for a while? So I think a lot has to do with the athlete's buy-in, and some are more definitely educated, or like, hey, they've really invested in their nutrition game plan, and others it's really starting from ground zero. A lot of guys, though, I'm working with, they did have a collegiate program that kind of set them up for success, or making those foundation, those building blocks of, okay, proper fueling, timing, and micronutrients. So they're a little bit educated, but it still gets lost in translation in that if you look at the MLB, their season, a normal season, I mean, they're playing 162 games in 183 days. Like, that's intense. That's
very
that's
intense.
grinding. So if you're missing out, even say 50% of those games, you're really setting yourself out for that burnout or that lackluster performance when it really matters during that championship time period. So a lot of it's still education. It's a huge missing gap. Because they might read something, but how can they actually implement that or make a positive change? And keeping it simple, because there's going to be 20 other things on their plate that really makes more of that static come up. So hard for them to shift through what nutritional application is really going to make an impact for them.
So you mean there's some that are just, well, you said stuck in their ways. They've just been doing the same thing for so long that it's kind of hard for them to transition.
Yes, totally. And then there's others that they're like, hey, I really want to be invested. And others where I want to create a dialogue. I want to support them. So how can I best support them and build that relationship where they can trust me? And so in those two, there's times where injury happens, and then it's like, hey, let's try to change X, Y, and Z to help promote getting you back to return to play and decreasing your risk for injury in the future. So sometimes that buy-in too helps translate the nutrition message you're trying to do.
Well, realistically speaking, when someone actually buys into what it is that you're trying to teach them, do you actually see changes?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because it depends on what their goal is and what their needs are. So how can I help meet their goals? And so specifically for, say, if it's performance wise, okay, so they want to, get stronger or decrease their risk for injury. Specifically, maybe they want more playing time. Well, let's look at what they're doing from a nutrition standpoint. So I call that, like, we're looking at their performance nutrition plan. And so, for example, if a guy's like, or a girl's not eating like breakfast or skipping a meal, and then they go to the workout, if they're at the facility all day, they're not fueling, or they go home and there's nothing in their cupboards because they have nothing planned, then they're really going to probably be increased risk for low energy availability. So they're just going to come to practice, work just as hard as their friend next to them, but then just come up 2% short. Right. So it's like really trying, okay, how can we make that change? Especially when you're traveling. And I know it's a little bit different right now with traveling, but there's not a lot available. Sometimes restaurants are closed, or, are they in a hotel room for extended period of time? What resources do they have available to them? Are they in a dorm room? So how can we really make a difference from, say, they have a 5 a.m., 6 a.m. practice, then they have a 9 a.m. class, or they have to go to a meeting at 9 a.m., they're showering and skipping a meal. So that's their recovery meal. They've just blown out the window. So really trying to, okay, can we throw in your bag? Or how we can make a change so where we actually see that nutrition in there to help start the recovery process.
You see, this is why I just did not do athletics.
Yeah.
We're not going to, you're not my diet. We're not going to go into my diet. It's better now than it was. But this sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you, the public's perception, I think, not of everyone, I think people that are really into sports, they know these guys and ladies they're really trying to put themselves in tip-top shape. But I do think there's a portion of society that doesn't really understand that they're not just putting a ball in a hoop. They're not just going out there and throwing a ball around. There's actual work that goes into it before they step on the field. And it's intense.
Yep.
It's very intense. And most people wouldn't want to put in that kind of work. And the work that goes into it, I mean, and again, this is what we were talking about with being D3, D2. You see how we sort of put ourselves in a category? We sort of know where we lie against some of these athletes, like I was in a track meet with Percy Harvin. You know what that is? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I saw that guy's just his back. And you can, and it was a track meet. So all I saw was his back, and you can just tell there's a different level to what some of these people are able to do. And it doesn't come easy. Though to some it does, but to others, there's a lot of work that gets put in.
Oh yeah. Huge. Like, it's like, I like to think of it, a performance nutrition can make a great athlete good, and a performance nutrition can make a good athlete great. So it's like some of that genetics you're talking about, like they're gone. Like you're not gonna see them. It's like, thank you, next.
Different levels.
It's amazing to see that type of competition and that type of level of athleticism. But yeah, there's so many, and that's where I think the public's perception too can be like, oh, they can just go do that. There's like, no, there's so much that goes into it. When you're looking at that lens of that like athletic context. For example, like you need more structured eating patterns when your training loads and demands are really high or moderate. And there also needs to be planning ahead. Like if you don't plan ahead, you're not laying the foundations for success. So for example, I had a student athlete who had a 12-hour day with all of their classes, practice, weightlifting. And then it started at 5 a.m. You're out on the water at 6 a.m. or whatever sport they're doing. And then dinner was until 9 p.m. And then they had another 6 a.m. the next day. So they're really, they were just snacking throughout the day. So they really missed some opportunities because there's nothing in their fridge or cupboards. Because, virtual classes right now, but like still, if you don't have some of that pre-planned for that specific day, it makes it a lot harder. And then they also need to have, enhanced like nutrition knowledge and ability to apply that knowledge. So if they were having, for example, that meal, especially in that evening, we want to make sure it's carb heavy. We have that protein, and then we have, fruits or veggies in there too, because they're having that early morning practice that they want to refuel their system that was definitely depleted throughout that day.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah, I'm getting tired just hearing about this.
Yeah. There's a lot of time commitment. They're time sensitive. So time is a commodity.
Well, now we're getting more in depth into the heart of why we're having this conversation, right? Are there sports that require a more detail-oriented approach to food?
So I think, that's an interesting question, because I think yes and no. And I say that, first I'll explain. So like specifically, you have some weight class sports with boxing, martial arts. So some of the combat sports, and then also some of the other weight class sports like rowing, where they will do weigh-ins, and you have to have a specific and targeted like hydration and fueling plan, because you really do run the risk of an athlete really going awry in that area, and it can be incredibly not healthy. And so you want to make sure that you're supporting them, their health and their well-being. And so that can be very specific in what that looks like for rehydration. But then, for example, like with MLB, you have those games I mentioned, where you have 162 competitions in 182 days and all that traveling. Like that's just as targeted and detail oriented in food preparation, when you're going to eat, timing, a game might be canceled and then, okay, you have a double header. So what does that look like for fueling strategy? And the same thing too, for like, say a runner, right? So a professional marathoner isn't going to run 162 marathons in a year, or, they usually don't. They usually just have a couple key ones that they're going to go for. And so their race is just as important, though, specifically what's their training load going to look like, what's their fueling strategy going to be, and how are they going to implement it in race, because they have fewer of those opportunities that if nutrition goes awry or so they have some GI distress during the race, it doesn't go well. So I feel like every athlete has an opportunity where they do have to be detail oriented. When we look again at the timing, you need a little bit more structure, and then also making sure that you have that ability to, okay, how do I implement the knowledge? Like, do I need protein after workout, And then I get a lot of athletes where they get the protein intake because they know that's so important post-workout for recovery, but then they completely miss the carbs, which is so important for their muscle fuel and just overall energy availability. So so it makes it tough.
It's different. Yeah. So you mentioned, well, for people that are listening that are not into athletics or sports, you mentioned the weight classes.
Yeah.
And you said boxing, just fighting in general, anything with like a combat sport, and running you mentioned also, where it might be more advantageous to be a little lighter than it is heavier. Yeah. And with the weight classes, people tend to cut weights. I'm not all that familiar with that. But if you don't make a certain weight, you can't compete.
Yeah. And it can be very, that's where it is specifically with the looking at the running and the ideal of lighter equals a better runner can be very detrimental because it can have a significant impact on their mental health and lead to risks of underfueling. And so I try to work with an athlete shifting that focus of body conscious, specific numbers, weight to how are you feeling? What impacts your well-being and also your performance. So what does that look like? Looking not at a weight-centric approach, but more at a intuitive eating, mindful eating approach where we want to fuel to perform, not fuel for a number on a scale. Because that happens too with the weight class sports where it gets really ingrained for the athletes. They have to make a certain amount of number on a scale, and that's their self-worth. So you want to be very strategic and planned out. If you have, for example, a rehydration, refueling game plan for someone that's doing a combat sport and has to weigh in, because you don't want to see very harmful behaviors used where then they suddenly are dehydrated or they have organs shutting down because they're depleted. They don't have the electrolytes and they have lost too much fluid.
Well, how often does that happen?
That can happen more often than you think, especially because a lot of, for example, with limiting intake and low energy availability, you see it more so in females, but it happens in male sports across the spectrum. But you don't see acute sometimes responses from it. So for example, if we broke an arm or like a leg, like boom, we know we have a broken bone.
You see that all the time, actually. That's not.
Yeah, like there's a protocol, you know okay, you're going to go to X, Y, and Z. You're going to have ortho. You're going to go to PT. You're going to work with your athletic trainer. Like it's very visual. You have a boot on your leg or you have a cast on your arm. But when you're under fueling, you don't see that. And sometimes until it's worst case scenarios and you don't want to get there with an athlete. And so then that it runs the risk of low bone mineral density, increased risk for injury, lower ability to recover. So the work they're putting in, they're not getting as much out. And then the return to play can be delayed if they're injured. And their stores, so their micronutrient stores, they can have increased risk for deficiencies. So then that can lead to, issues with, again, injury risk, and then being unable to recover as well, having increased muscle strains, injuries, and then just not sleeping as well. And it can also affect their mood. So increased risk in depression, anxiety, which then, has a whole body look when you're working with an athlete. Right. So underfueling is often, I think, idolized too in sports. Like, oh yeah, they're eating well, or they're watching what they're eating because they're going to have to go perform. So, and that can be praised by coaches when in actuality the athlete might be restricting, where it's becoming harmful to their health and their mental well-being.
Yeah, you specialize in one of your specialties is eating disorders, correct?
Yeah. So when I was at in Pittsburgh, I developed the first eating disorder and outpatient sports nutrition services with Excella Health, and that's a hospital system out there. And so then a lot of times, for example, I had an athlete who first year there he got injured, and then he had gained weight, and then when he had lost the weight, he was congratulated by the coaching staff and also the sports med team that was working with him. But there was a lot of underlying binge eating disorder behaviors that were being implemented. And so it's like, well, if you look on paper, coaches or other team members would be like, yeah, he's good, he's back to where he was before. But how's the athlete doing? What's the context that they're at, right? So what are they implementing to recover? So that was definitely a different story when I delved more into it with that consult.
Yeah, well, I worked with eating disorder patients for a few months, maybe 3 months. And one of the common themes that I would always hear from them is just what you mentioned, which is people making comments to them when they lost weight, and that sort of just fueled their desire to continue losing more and more weight because that made them feel as though they would receive more compliments and make them feel better about themselves. But even after losing the weight, they still weren't all that happy.
And then over time, it's like it can increase risk for burnout. Also, it can be lifelong, something they struggle with. It's a mental health disease, and again, like it can happen to all sports. So it's not one specific sport, but we know there's an increased prevalence with disordered eating disorders in sports in itself, and then within that, your more athletic sports like diving, gymnastics, ballet, dance, weight category sports that I mentioned, and like endurance sports, those are going to be a little bit more increase in prevalence when you're looking at the sports athletic world.
Yeah, I mean, now that I know more, every time I watch the Olympics and I see gymnasts, I just always think, how did they become such great athletes? And
hmm
because I think a lot of them are very concerned about their weight and making sure that they can make all of the spins and the twerk,
Yeah.
whatever it is that they do. There's a lot
Yeah.
of pressure on them to make or to be a certain weight.
And to look a certain way. And that's really ingrained, with gymnastics, they start at a very early age, right? So there's a specific type they feel like that is ideal in the athletic community that's deemed advantageous. And that does not mean it's advantageous for performance and also for the larger context of them being a healthy and happy athlete.
For people that again don't have that much experience with, I don't know, diet, eating disorders, or sports in general, what are some things that you as a dietitian might be on the lookout for when you see someone that might be at risk for what we just discussed in terms of eating disorders or what I'll call body dysmorphic disorder?
Yeah, like body dysmorphia. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you definitely. So that's a great question because you definitely want just be aware and cognizant of, there's a definitely increased risk in potential excessive exercise. So training, extreme rigidity. So they cannot deviate from that training cycle or what's prescribed. Restriction. So fueling wise, there's other eating disorder behaviors you can look out for. For example, are they limiting their social interaction around food? So they're like, oh, you know what, I'm going to go study. I'm going to go back to the hotel room. I already have dinner. So they're limiting their social interactions. They're making sure, for example, like they have more control in that context. And then also they can't not exercise. So they have to be active. So off days can be really tough, like those recovery days where there's no activity or light activity. And recovery is where you get stronger. And I know when I was a student athlete, I didn't learn that until later on when I went to Virginia Tech. And that really made a huge difference with my coach there when he really highlighted, I want you off. I want you recovering. I want you fueling. I want you taking a mental breather. And then you really saw that improvement in performance. So those are things that you definitely want to be looking at. Also, what's their past injury history? is there a lot of bone injury or stress fractures reactions? If you're 5 times more likely to get a stress fracture if you're under fueling, and not just not eating calcium or getting enough protein, under fueling, so low energy availability, so under eating. So that's another thing to look at. How's their sleep? Are they poor quality sleep? Are they waking up frequently? They're just feeling fatigued. And also their type of, like, if you're working with them, in person, they're showing up and they really have a flat affect. Like, they're just not present, because a lot of that times, your brain needs fuel. And it's like they're going through a fog. So it's really hard to be engaged.
Okay. Yeah. And actually, because we talked about under eating for the most part, you work with football teams.
Yep.
People, they never get any credit. The linemen, they never get any credit. Wide receivers, quarterbacks, defensive backs, even, they get credit. The linemen, no one talks about the linemen like they should. The backbone of every offense and defense. So I want to give them some attention to. Do you find, or have you found, either from yourself or colleagues, an issue with overeating with linemen?
I would say they tend to potentially have that risk of overeating a little bit higher than the other positions, because those are go, go, go. I mean, linemen, they still, because you're, 300-pound plus in the NFL, you still want to be like around 6,000 calories potentially. So that's a lot, but a lot of times they'll be just told at collegiate, you got to get bigger, you got to get stronger.
Right.
So you do see that overconsumption. So it's happening from a place where they're told they have to look and be a certain way to get that performance, versus having that slower gain where they also have time to develop. So yeah, you do tend to see that, and they're trained to not listen to their signals. So instead of adding another fueling opportunity or increasing, say, healthy fats, like having more avocados or nuts, or adding, oil to, like, olive oil to their rice, they're just pounding whatever they can do to try to get to meet that weight.
Yeah. Again, got to think about the linemen.
Yep.
I mean, for folks that don't know anything about sports, I'm talking about on a football team, the linemen. Some of these guys are 6'7", 320 pounds, 350 pounds plus. So you can imagine most people don't come that size, and they got their way with lifting weights and also eating a lot of food. So
a lot. And when they're a lot. Oh my gosh. And I had one too it was a training camp. It was hot, you're doing a double, they're doing doubles. And the player, and he's in the NFL now, but the player came up to me and he had been pulled from practice the day before. And I was like, well, what's happening? What's going on? He's like, I feel terrible. And so come to find out, he had 5 steaks the night before, cut out the potato, cut out, any juice or any like rice, because his muscles were sore. So he assumed if he had more protein, it'd help with muscle recovery. But when he showed up to practice the next day, he didn't have breakfast. And so then he had no carbohydrates in his system. So he just couldn't finish the workout. So he had no juice, he had no gas in the tank. So it's really like, okay, so X, Y, and Z, we're going to add in this carbohydrate. And yes, you need more energy intake, but you also need those carbs to fuel your muscles.
See, this is what scares me. Athletes, guys in particular, because I worked with a few female athletes when I did track, but I'm just going to speak on guys. We just come up with these weird, these no science behind them, regimens for us to eat, make absolutely no sense. If you sat down with an actual dietitian, you say, what the hell are you doing? What? Did you say 5 steaks?
Yeah, I was like 5. I was like, wasn't it like, I think it was ribeye. I forget, because this was like 5 or 4 years ago. And I was like, you just had the steak? I was like, what with the potato? He was like, no, I just had the steak. I know. Wow. I was like, oh.
Needed more protein. That's all that was. Wanted the protein. I actually wish that I had, and I thought about it yesterday. I wish I had pulled up the Rock's Dwayne Johnson. What he does is he has his crazy workouts, but he has like a cheat day. And I wish I had pulled up his cheat day, the stuff that he eats on his cheat day. It's insane.
Yeah. Because they have such a large energy intake, so that they can. It's definitely. I love hearing every athlete's food and preference and how and schedule and what they do for nutrition wise.
Yeah. So anyone who's listening right now, just look up the Dwayne The Rock Johnson's cheat day meals. I'm not going to do it right now because, this is a podcast. So look it up. It's quite interesting. Okay. So last question for you. If I gave you unlimited funds, unlimited resources, unlimited funds, what changes would you make at the level of, I don't know, high school, college, pros, when it comes to, I guess, maybe the understanding or the approach to diet and wellness?
Oh my gosh. That would be a dream. That would be, yeah. Oof.
What are you dreaming about then?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's start with high school, then collegiate, then professional. So high school education, it's huge. So when I was a high school athlete, I remember I went to my strength and conditioning coach and was like, what can I do nutrition wise? And he recommended Nancy Clark's sports nutrition guidebook, which is awesome, especially for high school athletes. And I read that, but it's like, that was the only help I got, So nowadays there's a little bit more. For sure. And it's growing, which is exciting. The sports nutrition field and dietitians in it are growing. So that's helping contribute. So we would definitely want education, and not just education to the high school athletes. You'd want it to the parents, to the coaches, because that's a lot where misinformation comes, and that sets the foundation for their careers potentially with what messaging is put out there at an early age. So I would do that. I would have fueling stations for them. And so when I'm talking about fueling stations, you see in the collegiate and professional setting where they can walk in, say at their gym area, where they can grab a smoothie, a fruit bowl, protein mixes, powders. So anything recovery wise is readily available, or pre-workout wise, or during. So if they're having a longer workout, they can grab a Gatorade or a sports drink. And so they can go and refuel with that. And then I would love to have just education with cooking classes. So having the student athletes actually like make energy balls, or when would you use this? What does a recovery meal look like? What's something quick you can make? Because I'm telling you, when I get into, especially some of the collegiate guys, like I had one player didn't know how to cut an avocado correctly. I was like, you're going to lose a thumb. So it's good they're learning these life skills, because you're going to have to learn how to eat for the rest of your life. So, and I don't think that's like, cooking classes are, I think, not a thing anymore in the high school education, depending on where you're at. So I would definitely have that. And right.
No, listen. That you're speaking, this music to my ears, because I'm learning how to, I stopped learning how to cook actually a few weeks ago. I learned 5, because I don't know how to cook. I basically just ate rice for 32 years after I moved out of my mother's house, and a lot of already pre-made meals.
Yep.
From the grocery store. And again, just making up my own regimen, just telling myself it was healthy, and having and I'm a doctor, by the way. I don't know what I'm doing. No idea what I'm doing. But no, the cooking classes, that sounds fantastic. I would take a cooking class now, but I think I'm sort of, like you mentioned earlier, I'm set in my ways, and I've found things that I think are healthy enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it can be. I mean, you want it healthy, but you also want it where you're human. So you want all foods, to include. And I think helping especially high school athletes navigate that, because their friend, or for example, I had a high schooler who didn't finish a pretty big collegiate race because she had gone on a low carb diet since her dad was first recently diagnosed with diabetes. So the messaging in that household was sugar is bad. We need to cut it out. We need to really regulate it. And for a growing female athlete, running a 5K and then not being able to finish it, like you need that carb there. So yeah, so it's like having that implementation where you have those cooking demos, and then also food access is huge. And I see it throughout the whole high school, collegiate, professional level. Food access isn't readily available to all athletes. So individuals can struggle with trying to fuel their bodies appropriately when there's, limited income where they're located. And if I had unlimited funds, that would be the first thing I would want to address, making sure we had food access to all, and not just in season, out of season too. So when they're off season, they're recovering, they're taking time away from the sport.
Yeah, I did a shameless plug here. I did an episode about food deserts with a guy that opened up a store in a food desert, and it's difficult to do for multiple reasons. You can check out that episode, whoever's listening to this now, if you want to learn more, but that's difficult in itself. So I guess that's why I gave you unlimited funds to make these changes.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. And I definitely hit up that episode. Cause it's so, I still get professional athletes, you know, especially in the minor leaguer, where it's like, they're trying to make a big break and then they have limited funds, or they're having inaccessible ability to cook a lot. They might have like a hotel stay for several months or weeks, and then they're cooking in their microwave. And you can get really resourceful and really budget friendly, and that's what I work with them. But it's still limited. So you want to, and I see it too in the collegiate. I mean, you're still going to have food insecure athletes, and I don't think it's talked about enough. So that would be my first unlimited fund to be addressed.
You mean in terms of when they're in college, they don't really have the funds, maybe even the access to the food to feel they're sort of on their own?
Yeah. Even in a D1 program, you know, you have the fueling station, they have meals prepared potentially for, you know, pre and then post workouts, like teams will have meals there. But then, you know, what does the apartment look like? What are they going back to? Are the cupboards bare? Do they have Cliff Bars, or do they have anything that they're going to have for dinner if it's not provided by the team or by the fueling station? Is the fueling station unlimited, or is it, hey, you get a certain number of points you're using X, Y, and Z for each day. Once you hit that, you know, the fueling station's kind of closed.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think those are all great things. And just to recap, education, that's one thing, you know, addressing access to food at all socioeconomic levels. And I think you said fueling stations.
Yeah, fueling. I would have it in high school, collegiate, and professional. And then, I mean, most professionals do, but collegiate, they're still like the D2s, D3s. They're starting to get more fueling stations where they have that accessibility to their athletes. But I'd still want to make sure across the board you would have that there. And then also the quality of the food. It'd be really, really cool with unlimited budgeting that you could source more locally. So within Washington, we have great, you know, apples, great fall vegetables. So being able to use like local farmers and then bringing that in. I know Virginia Tech had a great like community garden that you could go and use. And then there's even some schools that are doing like an athlete community garden where athletes can go and grow their own fruits and vegetables. Because again, that's a privilege to be able to have access to growing your own fruits and vegetables, especially if you're in a city or in a more urban area.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, after this interview, maybe we'll go over my diet and you'll. Although yeah. I think it's good now. We'll talk about it. But it's nothing like the rocks. It's nothing like it was 10 years ago.
Hey, it can change. It's the transitional life changes. You know, it's the season. So.
Well, age did it to me, but again with athletes, they're more on the younger end of the spectrum, and they just what I do I work with adolescents and young adults, and when you're in that age period and that time period in your life, you're worried about other things.
Totally.
You worry completely different things than your health or worrying about how your heart is going to function in your 50s.
Increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Like that's not something I'm going to bring into a session, especially with a high schooler. Yeah, collegiate, nope. And then and so I would say for more of the professional, when they're on the kind of the last half of their career, they're more
when they care.
That's
when they care.
Anti-inflammatory. Like you want to really be targeted and make sure like, okay, what can we really dial in to get that next or that last contract?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for I don't have any other questions for you. Thank you for stopping by. We could probably talk more, but I think in terms of the topic, I'm going to stick to the topic today. I'm trying to be a good podcast host here.
Well, I think you're awesome. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you stopping by and speaking with me. It was great. And maybe in a few months, we'll talk again. Who knows?
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.